This is the first time I'm using this mould. Little did I know it was going to be the last as well. Hey, welcome back to my channel. It's Wendy here from Toonpish Crafts and I hope you're doing okay. Sometimes I just fancy making crystals. I do love the appearance of crystals and I have quite a lot of crystal moulds in my collection. I've got the set of 2 moulds from Resin which I've never used before, and I have 2 sets. So I'm definitely going to make those today. And I have a tray mould that's quite a cheap one from a foreign land that represents diamondy gem type things on the base, and I thought I'd try that out too. So let's have a go at mixing crystals with gems and see what we get. So this is the mould in question. It's a Temu mould. Now I know a lot of people don't like shopping at Temu, but we have very little choice here in the UK and it's affordable. I'm going to use Dragon to start with. This is one of Emma's colours that is available on toonpish.com, and the link for this will be in the description box below. Now, who in their right mind would put an empty container back on the shelf? Oh, there's none in there. Well, I guess I did. Let's get a new one out then. I've done it before and I'll probably do it again. If I didn't put it back on the shelf empty, I wouldn't know to replace it, so that's why I do it. Silly things, eh? But I'm using Dragon and I'm going to completely cover this mould in this stunning colour. Do love this colour. It's one that actually covers pretty much the spectrum of colour. And as it flakes, it will stick to this silicone mould really nicely. So I'm going to push it all down with a very soft makeup brush and burnish it into the mould, ready for me to pour resin. Now, as I've said before, these colours are not cheap, but they do cover a large area and I absolutely love them, so I use them a lot. Once it's completely coated, I have a stunning coloured silicone mould, and I'm just turning it over to see what the diamond pattern looks like in the back, because you never know, do you? This is the first time I'm using this mould. Little did I know it was going to be the last as well. I'm going to be using black polyurethane resin from MB Fiberglass for this make. It's the last of the bottle that I had, and although it's thick and gloopy, it should work perfectly fine. Old stock, but at the end of the day, it's going to be black. So the fact that one part looked absolutely gross and disgusting, pretty gross looking, doesn't make a blind bit of difference really. You've only got 30 seconds to stir this stuff because it goes off really quickly. And as I'm pouring quite a large amount, which is quite unusual for me, I make sure I stir it from the bottom right the way and scrape the edges in that 30 seconds. Once I'm happy that I've stirred it enough, then I'll pour it out into the mould. Now I know MB Fiberglass only ship to the UK because of the chemicals that they have, but there are other companies in other countries that sell black polyurethane resin. I do know that you can't use a flame or a torch on polyurethane as it is flammable, so usually I use isopropyl alcohol to get rid of surface bubbles like you do with 2-part epoxy resin, but today I'm using a heat gun which works just as well. It'll pop all those bubbles that rise to the surface, although this is the back, so it really doesn't make that much difference. 1 hour later and I can demold. Now this is quite a thin piece, so I did leave it for an hour, but it cures in 40 minutes anyway. I've left some of the demolding sounds in for you on this video. I know some of you really like the demolding sounds. It came out of the mould really clean and it's absolutely stunning. Now it is bobbly, but it's a flat bobbly, you know, it's a flat tray. I don't want to leave it completely bobbly like that, and I'm going to do something else to it. But to start with, this piece has a line around the outside, and that makes it perfect for me to get a silicone inlay from the piece. So I pick up some Let's Resin 2-part silicone rubber, and I'm going to make myself an inlay from the piece before I do anything else. I've made up around 30 to 40 mil, not very much. It needs to be a thin layer. So once I've given it a good stir for 3 minutes, I can pour it over the top of this piece. Now, as I said, there wasn't a lot of silicone for this inlay. It just needs to cover everything. Now, although silicone is really slow moving, it is self-leveling and it will run, even though it takes quite a long time compared to resin to move. It does move. So because this piece has a line around the outside, I know I'm pretty safe at pouring it on top. Although you do have to have a completely flat surface. My surface isn't completely flat, but it is acceptable for this kind of thing. It's not a great huge inlay, it's just tray size, and I'm happy that I'm not selling these, I'm just using it for myself. So it doesn't matter if it's slightly, ever so slightly, deeper on one side than the other. That's fine with me. I'm spreading out the silicone. Now I know it self-levels and it does spread itself out, but it won't go over the top of something. You have to encourage it to go over the top of some of the stones, just to make sure it's got a layer that you can use. By the way, don't forget to pop that thumbs up button if you enjoy my content. It really does help my channel out. Now you can demold this silicone after 3 to 4 hours. You can't really use it for 24 hours because it's still curing, but you can take it off of the mould that you're using. So I'm going around the outside edge, just lifting up the silicone from the tray. So when I go to demold the whole thing, the edges, as they are the thinnest part, are not going to rip. And I have myself a gorgeous, very shiny silicone inlay to be used at another time. I'm not going to use that today, but I wanted to take that impression before I did anything else with the tray. Now, while I had the silicone out, I decided to make a larger amount and try and make a reverse silicone inlay from the mould itself. I've done this before plenty of times, but you never know if the silicone that you use is going to attach itself to the mould itself. As I'm pouring a larger amount of silicone, it's not so thin, I do degas it in the degassing machine from Let's Resin. I find that really does help in deeper pours. So this is me pouring the silicone that I've just made into the silicone mould, hoping that I can get a reverse silicone inlay from the mould itself. I didn't know whether this would work. You're never sure whether you're going to ruin the mould or the silicone that you've poured in. You just got to wait and fingers crossed, really. And I was willing to take the risk because I thought I'd show you yes or no whether it worked or not. Somebody asked me recently, how can you tell which silicones will attach to which silicones? And you know what? I don't have the answer for that. If anybody has a chemical degree and can answer that question, I would be grateful. Or some knowledge, more than my own. So a few hours later, I can take this silicone out. Now immediately while trying to dislodge the edge, I can feel that the silicone I'm taking out that I've poured is sticky. This does not bode well. The stickiness of the Let's Resin silicone that I've poured has obviously reacted with the silicone that I've poured it into. It does happen. It's not foolproof. And even though I have a silicone inlay, it is sticky and really not worth having. Completely useless. But I tried it. I thought I'd show you just in case you wanted to do this yourself with this particular mould. It does not work. Moving away from the silicone after that experience. These are the Let's Resin crystal moulds, and ideally they have their own stamp and the amount of resin that you need to pour into them, which I think is fantastic. More companies need to do this, so I know exactly how much resin I'm going to need for all 4 of these resin crystals. So I mix up some 2-part epoxy resin and I'm going to add a little tiny bit of colour. I'm going to use the Resin Diamond Aurora Mica Powder in blue, which is their number 5. The pots only have numbers on them. They don't have colour labels, and they all have their own little individual metal casing to stop the powders coming out on travel, which is a really good idea. I am using such a small amount of this resin. It's just literally just to give it a shade. Rather than being completely clear, I just want a little shade of something through it, so you can see it rather than it being crystal clear. So my resin is all made and it has a beautiful blue shimmer, and I'm just going to pour it into these moulds. I'm not going to be using my pressure pot. I have a pressure pot, but I don't use it very often on YouTube videos because I know a lot of people don't have them. They are extremely handy in this kind of scenario. It will make sure there is no bubbles in there at all. However, if you do it properly, you reduce the chance of getting bubbles in your pieces. With something like this, you need to get some kind of pokey stick. I'm using a micro brush that has a little tiny brush on the end, and you can push it down into the mould to release any stuck air that gets stuck in the points. You saw me also squeezing the mould. This will help, but a micro brush really does do the trick. You could use a cocktail stick or anything soft like a little toothbrush. You know those little toothbrushes that you can get? You can get disposable ones that are like for pushing in between your teeth. I hope you understand what it is I'm talking about. You can use those. Something soft that isn't going to damage the mould. Cocktail sticks might damage your mould. If you're gentle, they won't. But something that won't damage your mould is preferable. I spray these pieces with isopropyl alcohol. I cover them up to cure and I leave them on the worktop for 24 hours. 24 hours later and I can demould. I do think these crystal moulds look quite spectacular before you've even demoulded, and I have high hopes for these pieces. Not only could I make the exact amount of resin that I needed because they were all labelled with their own measurement of resin, they've got this very, very slight aurora blue tint to them, and I think they're going to turn out quite nice. Again, I've left the demoulding sounds in for you, although there's not many, to be honest with you. It didn't pick up that much squeaking and squirking. But I think they've came out absolutely beautiful, and if you look closely, I can't see any bubbles in there. Let's Resin is fantastic at dispersing air through the resin. If you don't have a pressure pot, it is definitely one to consider. Because I've been quite meticulous with the micro brush to reduce the amount of air and bubbles that are in the tips, they have come out almost flawless. By the way, I didn't say these moulds come in pairs. You get a large one and a little one in the pair. And the little ones are just as sweet as the large ones. So I have 2 pair here. So now I'm going to join the tray and the crystals together. To do that, I'm going to use Let's Resin epoxy resin. And I'm going to also add some holographic glitter in silver. That is from Let's Resin holographic glitter pack. I've put a tiny amount in the clear resin and I'm going to top coat this tray in clear glittered resin. I don't want to overdo it. This tray does have the lip around it, which we found earlier on before I did the silicone inlay. So it has a natural barrier to stop resin going over the edge. I do have this piece on the Let's Resin levelling table. I use it a lot. It will lay things perfectly flat. And I have the black silicone mat over the top of the levelling table to try and blend in with my black background. You push the resin up to the edge, but you don't push it over the edge. And resin won't go where resin hasn't been before, so it should sit quite nicely on the top of this tray, as long as I don't over pour it. I have made about 80 ml of resin and I just about have enough. I could have done with another 10 ml really, but 80 ml was just about right. So I'm just making sure that I'm gone up to the edge with this resin. I'm using a heat gun because if I was to use isopropyl alcohol, it would break the surface tension and the resin would flow off of the tray. So when you're top coating, don't use isopropyl alcohol. A heat gun or a long neck lighter works so much better. Once I've got the piece completely coated, I place my crystals on top and make sure I just embed them into the resin so they are fully secure. I have trimmed up the edges of the small pieces as they weren't flat. They had the curing edge where they recessed after curing, so I trimmed all that down to make sure that they were perfectly flat. I go over it again with a hot air gun to get rid of any bubbles that are now risen, and I leave it to cure for 24 hours. But at this point, I did think it was looking a little too plain and simple. So I went on to Creative Fabrica and I found a really beautiful silhouette of a fairy with a butterfly. I cut it out on silver vinyl on my xTool M1 Ultra. I weeded it and I transferred it onto the centre of this tray, and I think it has brought it to life. One simple thing like a silhouette of a fairy with a butterfly has just brought this tray absolutely to life, and I really like it. I really like the colours. I love the way the fairy sits in the centre of the crystals. The butterfly is just perfect. It's funny how one little detail can make or break a piece. And I hope you've enjoyed this one. Come back and see me next week, because you never know what I'm going to be up to. I never know what I'm going to be up to. Have a great week, happy crafting, and bye for now.